So let's start. Hopefully they will join. So yesterday we talked about that compensated demand curve. And before we start, how many of you present now would get the chance to have a look at that compensations and the compositions? So I'll sincerely request all of you because that will be important. Now, so basically, this is how we're measuring that surplus, right? So this is devoid of the income effect. It's only the substitution effect which is being captured because I'm using calculated demand curves and the area under the demand curve and um, the market clearing price. You get the shaded zone as in front of your screen. In this simple graph, you understand that surplus. Now, how to measure this efficiency? The question that we'll be asking is how much am I willing to give up to remove efficiency? Okay. If there is inefficiency, how much I am willing to give up to remove inefficiency? Now, take for example, we all know that if you bring in tax, so just think about a simple graph um, where you have a demand curve, and suppose you have a supply curve like this. This should have been the market clearing price. Suppose with tax I'm getting here. So this portion, this will be the quantity transacted and demanded. And hence this triangle will give you a David loss, correct? Now you ask an individual, suppose this is the market for cigarettes, and we all know in all the countries in the world will have taxes on cigarettes. So take for example, you ask a person that you want this deadweight loss to be removed because there are taxes on cigarettes. So how much lump sum tax are you willing to give? So how much are you willing to give up? Remember the moment I'm talking about how much you're willing to give up to remove inefficiency, that means how much tax I am willing to give. Not the tax imposed on the cigarettes, but maybe I'm just not so that if there is a tax on the cigarette, it will be P into 1 plus the tax. I'm saying no, it will be the new thing. So instead of the deadweight loss generated when I'm having tax which is reflected in the price and hence resulting in certain deadweight loss and hence inefficiency. I'm just asking you, remove this part, but give a lump sum tax so that your budget line shifts in. If that is the case, look, if this is going out, so I'm left with only the market clearing price, my deadweight loss is not there. But I'm earning the same revenue by imposing a lump sum tax. So how much are you willing to give up to remove this inefficiency? So how much capital T are you willing to give up so that this small t ad valorem t is removed? And suppose someone says it's okay, $100. Now the question is, you are, as a consumer, you were paying this portion, P into small t, the tax part. And you are paying, suppose, the equivalent amount in the form of capital T. So your welfare does not change. But instead of an ad valorem tax, which impacts the price, you're paying a lump sum tax. So inefficiency in the market goes on. Okay. Now suppose initially, if that ad valorem tax, so P into small t, was less than 100, which was like, suppose, $80, and this person was willing to pay, say, $100 lump sum tax. So this difference in revenue, which is being generated through different taxation system, we'll call that a deadweight loss or excess burden of the tax. This measures what we call the efficiency of tax, or in this case, when deadweight loss is there, we'll call the inefficiency of the tax. Now you have a compensated demand schedule. Right? You put the market clearing price, suppose, at C0. With the tax on the cigarette, is which we call the cigarette tax, the price goes up to C0 plus T. You have a shaded region, you can see. Just right now I showed you this triangle, right? Same here. So I've just added the supply curve here. In this part, in this graph, there are no supply curves. It's only that demand part. Now, remember that lump sum tax or cigarette tax does not make any difference for me. But additional revenue of this triangle area would have been taken up, because if you leave, if you just impose a lump sum tax, your disposable, the consumer's disposable income falls. Its budget line shifts. That the price, the market price, remain unchanged. So it will come back to zero. And this will be the revenue which is lost. Or this is the deadweight loss. When you put tax on the commodity. The moment you remove tax on commodity, replace it by a lump sum tax, which just affects your income, then this shaded region will go out, which means this efficiency will be eliminated. Now, this is how we calculate the efficiency of a tax, of a production, or whatever. More complex will be the issue when we try to quantify the distributional effects. Okay. So, as we said yesterday, that think of two bridges, think of two villages located in the opposite banks of the same river connected through a bridge. So before the bridge, there was a boatman carrying people up and down, to and fro, from one village to another. Once the bridge is here, the boatman loses his job, his livelihood. So whenever we impose a particular tax, or we undertake a particular project, different cohorts will be affected differently, right? And I give you one real life example. And that real life example is that of owners of cultivable lands and MNREGA. In villages in rural India, not that all the farmers have their own land. So we call them landless farmers. What they do, they work on the fields of other people, and there is either a payment for the labor that is given, or what we call, there is something called a sharecropping, right? Now, what is sharecropping? Sharecropping is, it's your land, my labor, we share the yield. Simple. And now we do have a number of complications there, and we also have certain solutions for it. So that's a different story altogether. Not going into that. But a number of these owners of these lands have been have become historically used to lend the land for sharecropping or hire labor for cultivation. The only thing they do is they have a land and they take one part of the yield. Simple. Whether you pay in terms of wages, whether you share the crop or yield itself, basically you're getting a fraction of it, right? But mostly they do not give their labor, or they do not know how to cultivate it all. Now, with the advent of MNREGA, particularly these landless farmers who used to work under wage system. Suppose I will work on your field and you pay me this much amount a day. Simple. These people have vanished because now they are getting same or even more from that NREGA thing of 100 days assured employment. And in some states, that 100 days has been increased as well. So now, NREGA had a target as a, it was a concerted effort to generate employment for, and also you understand the type of work which is being undertaken under NREGA are in general public in nature. So the government hired these landless, or what we say jobless people, and involved them while undertaking certain public good, infrastructure development, all these things. Now, what that has had impact. So the cohort of people who are like landless farmers, it has been definitely beneficial to them. But for those people who had the land but could not cultivate, used to depend on the labor of these landless farmers, they got adversely impacted. And this is a true story from India. Okay. Now, from this very simple real life example, you can understand that for a particular tax or say particular, for tax, you can also think of a number of examples. So we'll discuss at length what we call the burden of tax. So suppose there is a commodity and tax is imposed. So who's going to share that tax? Who's going to bear the burden of that tax? Is it the seller or is it the consumer? That depends on what we'll see on elasticities. Okay. Now, different people will have different impacts, rather will get differentially affected. And there are cases where, like, if you bring in more types of cohorts, you will get even more, like what we'll say, like a combination, different combinations of distribution elements. So it becomes complex. So to implement a project and to uh, focus a project on a particular cohort, the governments across the world, they focus on certain summary measures. And why is this? Because efficiency is one part of the story and inequality is the other part of the story. And if inequality, as we have seen, is a problem, then who are getting more badly affected if there is no intervention, if there is no redistribution? Obviously, it is the poor. So I have to somehow identify the poor cohort of the economy. Remember the question? Take, for example, the Rawls criteria. Who is the worst of? So you have to increase the utility of the worst of person. Then it is very difficult to say on certain subjective parameters that who is worst of. And I gave that example: beggar in a metropolitan city vis-a-vis a landless farmer in Northeast. Who is worst of? To understand that, to understand who is poor, and even important, who is poorer, and hence might answer the final question, who is the poorest, you have a poverty index. In general, identification of that cohort by the name poor is of ultimate importance, because you know this is the target beneficiary group. So if I want to provide something to a particular group, I know who is poor. I have to identify them. Identify them. The first and most simple measurement that is created or that is being used is what we call the poverty index. And what is poverty index? It's an index that measures what proportion of the population lies below critical threshold. And as you can understand, this critical threshold is nothing but what we call the poverty line. And that is why you will find there are different definitions of poverty line which are being used in the academic discourse. There is a World Bank definition. Anyone earning less than $1 a day is poor. Sometimes that is also like less than earning less than $2 a day. Okay. In India, we have a separate type of a definition of poverty level. That is based on the money required to purchase a minimum calorie of food. So suppose from nutritional perspective, you know that this is the money you required to purchase food which will have a calorie equivalence of the minimum calorie requirement of a person. Right? And you have the money equivalent of that. So if someone is earning less than that, he's poor. Now that's also being challenged and says, okay, it's not only eating, you need to also stay. So bring in other parameters. And that's how, depending on the country, depending on the objective, in fact, you have different types of poverty. And we also use something called the head count ratio in India. Okay. So however we measure it, you have a critical threshold. You below that threshold, everyone is poor. Another measure, which has been very commonly used, is called a poverty gap. So the poverty gap is not only, look, this poverty index, it tells you how many people are below this critical threshold, right? So you get an aggregate number or an absolute number of people below that. But the question is, how far? So suppose if the poverty line says 50 rupees a day, is it that you're earning 49 rupees a day and that is why you are poor? Or you are earning 4 rupees a day, 1 rupee a day, and that is why you are poor? Or you are not earning at all anything, zero, you're poor. So the gap, the poverty gap, actually is a better measure to see or to somehow calculate or to measure how much income we have to give a particular poor person so that he reaches the threshold. Look, again, we are back in the domain of the teacher compensation, but in a reverse direction. So suppose we started with two indifference curves giving two different levels of utilities for the same person. And I asked how much money I should take away from him so that he reaches the lower. The reverse, how much I should give so that he reaches that utility level which is corresponding to the poverty level, that threshold. So how much I have to give? Again, we are back in the domain of the compensation principle. So that is why measuring the gap is very important. Another measure is something that measures overall inequality in the economy. And this is what we call the Lorenz curve. So it shows the cumulative fraction of a country's total income earned by, from, we start from below, poorest 5%, poorest 10%, 15%, and we go on. So basically, it tells you what share of the country's income is accurate to the bottom 5%, bottom 10%, and then you keep on that. So if you want to have perfect equality, complete equality, then obviously the 20% of income should go to the 20% of people. 40% should go to the 40% of the people. And the Lorenz curve will be a straight line, a 45 degree. And what will be a reverse scenario? Suppose 80% of the income is accrued to the top 5%. Then inequality will be really, really high. Now, let's look at this picture. Had there been no inequality, you would have this straight line, 45-degree line, right? Vertical axis, you have percent of income of the country and percent of population. So if 10% of population earns 10% of income, you're on that 45-degree line. So if we have complete equality, you have this straight line. If we have inequality, take for example, in this case, we can see that a point like this. So the bottom 40% of population earns 10% of the income. Look at the cursor. While a cursor point like this will tell you that 80% of the income, sorry, 40% of the income is accrued to 80% of the population. So basically 60% of the GDP is accruing to the top 20% of the population. And you have a bowed out curve like this. Higher the inequality, higher will be the, or greater will be the shaded gray zone. Now, with certain distributional policies, certain, sorry, taxations, tax subsidy regime, whatever, any distribution policy or redistribution policy, will try to reduce inequality. So if a policy is somehow successful in reducing inequality, then this type of movement in the Lorenz curve will happen. So initially, before the tax or before the program, before redistribution, this was the Lorenz curve. Post, it is here. Target is to converge it to the 45-degree line. Right? Now, next thing we need to understand is what we call compensation principle. Let's consider a particular situation that when we look at the aggregate picture, the macro picture, the total willingness to pay exceed the total cost of a particular project or a particular problem. However, for certain individual, from the micro perspective, the cost which is borne by these individuals exceed their individual willingness to pay. Right? This might happen. So there is a particular village cut off from the rest of the world, and you just need to construct, say, a 6-kilometer high road to connect it to the nearest state highway. Now, if the cost of this particular road, now all the villages will be benefited, but differently. So if I am a producer of something which I know there is a market outside my village, my willingness to pay for that road will be much higher than a small tea shop who caters only to the local people situated in the village, because no one from the highway will travel 6 kilometers inside the village to have a cup of tea. But he will also be benefited through other population effects, but not directly. So his willingness to pay will be less. But we know, the government knows, that the villagers is after S, you have an apostrophe. Villagers' willingness to pay in aggregate exceed the cost of construction of that road. The question is now, I know if there is this small tea shop owner whose willingness to pay is less than the cost he might have to bear, then whether we should take up this project or not. The compensation principle tells you what? If this aggregate willingness to pay exceeds the cost, it should be taken. Because you can always compensate the gainers. What do I mean? If total willingness to pay exceeds the cost, that means the total benefit is higher than the total cost. So there will be a person for whom the benefit will be higher than the cost share he bears. So he can compensate. Or the government can think of another redistribution policy to compensate the person for whom whose willingness to pay is less than the cost he bears. So what I know from a compensation principle, that if this happens, look, from all practical purposes, people are willing to pay. That means people will get benefited and hence they are willing to pay. Cost is suppose it's given. People can see the cost as well. If this happens, which means aggregate benefit is more than aggregate cost, you can compensate those who are adversely affected. So it is potentially parity improvement. If the distribution is not done, then I cannot say anything about parity improvement, because I know there is a group of people who are better off and a group of people who are worse off. But even then, if the aggregate benefit is more than the aggregate cost, that means you have a scope of compensating the worse off group such that they are neither worse off nor better off, and still have another cohort who are strictly better off. That means we have a potential for parity. And hence, this project should be undertaken. So you have now a measure of some efficiency, which is net benefit, and you have measures of inequality. So conceptually, you will be able to make some public decision, or at least now we'll be in a position to say for a particular project whether it is increasing efficiency, whether it is increasing equality, whether there is a trade-off, whether the increase in efficiency is more than the increase in inequality if both inequality and efficiency increases. So if efficiency increases and also inequality increases, but efficiency increases more, then you can use a compensation principle. So you are, at least theoretically, conceptually, in a position of public decision making with these very simple tools in your hand. Now, to understand, now you have the Pareto principle in your mind, then you should be looking after each and every individual and then use a social welfare function to add up these effects. So there are a set of people out of suppose n number of total people, k are better off, n minus k are worse off. So you can add them up. However, it is practically not feasible. In general, what the government does is to identify first certain group of people. So take for example, the government starts imposing an import tariff on a particular commodity. Who will be better off? If I'm imposing an import tariff, that means the foreign good. So it's the same good. Suppose we're talking about smartphones. A set of smartphones are produced in India and sold in India, and set of smartphones are imported into India and sold in India. Right? Now the government imposes some tariff or customs duty on the import of smartphones. What will happen? The foreign smartphones, the imported smartphones will become costly because of the price plus the tariff tax. Tariff is nothing but another tax. So who will be better off and who will be worse off? The users of smartphones will be worse off because they have to pay higher price. Who will be better off? The Indian smartphone makers. They have now an edge because their phones are not attracting this tax. Only the imported are attracting this tax. So you identify these major groups. For any policy, you will find a set of people who will be better off and will always find another set of people who will be worse off. That's the irony of the problem. Right? You cannot make everyone better off at the same time. You can if you start from an off the Pareto set position. But when you are already on the Pareto set, you can either make me happy or make yourself happy. Now, from the societal point of view, any movement on that Pareto set or that it is possible in this frontier, now you have certain measures. So you have to identify the major groups who are going to get positively affected and the other group who are adversely affected. Or another group who are moderately affected positively, moderately affected negatively. You start identifying major groups and try to see what is the impact on them. Okay. If this aggregate net benefit is positive, and along with poor people are net beneficiaries, rich are net losers. So aggregate net benefit positive means efficiency. Poor net beneficiaries means reduction in inequality. So this particular project increases both efficiency and equity, and it must be adopted. But in reality, you have a little more complex problem. say both poor and rich are worse off. Only the middle income group or the middle class are better off. Okay. So take for example a policy where you increase the price of petroleum and reduce and subsidize public transport in towns and cities. The middle class will be better off because they have been directly impacted by the lowering of this say, uh, state government bus services or the metro railway services. Rich who are using more luxury cars, having very low fuel efficiency vehicles, they are badly impacted. The poor who does not use much of public transport service because they are in remote villages, they get affected because of other transport costs going up due to increase in petroleum prices. Suppose I just need my fertilizer to cultivate my land. But because of rising petroleum, the transport people who are charging to ship the fertilizer to that village from the nearest distribution center, the truck fare has gone up. So they are also worse affected. So you can think of complex problems where one group is benefited, two groups adversely affected, and any combination of that. And the moment you increasing this number of cohorts, the complexity increases. What we do basically, we adopt for a weighted net benefit approach. We assign weights to the net gain, which can be positive or negative, to different groups of people. However, if your concern is equity, obviously, higher income group weights are lower, lower income group weights are higher. So this use of weights while making weighted net benefit approach, you have to consider the three assumptions. Diminishing marginal utility, the different individuals and the same relations between utility and income, and the society is concerned with total utility. Right? So when I assign higher weight to the poor people and lower weight to the richer people, what are basic assumptions we are making? When I'm talking about the poor, all the poor have very similar relation between utility and income. Because if you have very low income, and then a small increase in your income will increase your utility much higher. While the same increase in income will have very, very insignificant impact on the utility of rich people. Just give 100 rupees to a person earning 10 lakhs a month. What will be that impact? Epsilon. Give 100 rupees to a rickshaw puller. Significant. So all the poor will have very similar reaction in their utility with certain changes in income. All rich have similar. So different individuals in a particular cohort might have, or in general we assume, have the same relation between utility and income. We're talking about redistribution, right? So after redistribution, I'm giving say 100 rupees worth benefit to a particular cohort. So we are assuming all the people in that cohort will have equal impact. So their utility income relationship is almost similar. You cannot give one thing continuously because the marginal utility of marginal utility from consumption of that good will decrease, right? So to maintain that balance. So that is why you have to always keep in mind the diminishing marginal. And the final point that the society is concerned with total utility. Basically, when you have a social welfare function, you are giving weights and changes in utility. Some has positive and some has negative impacts. When you calculate the feasibility of the project, the efficiency and equality impact of that project, you have to consider the aggregate, the net benefit, the total net benefit. Okay. So these are the assumptions. That's admin. So remember, we started with social choice in theory, what we should do. And after that, we started pointing out number of problems and complexities, and also started giving very, very simple but effective solutions. So in practice, the first and foremost, which is not different from the theoretical part, that is identify parity improvement based on net benefit. Then when you implement a project, because you will implement a particular project which has parity improvement or potential parity improvement. Yes. So, Jyoti, would you like to say something? Or is it by accident that you are muted, unmuted?
Oh, sorry, it was accident. So sorry.
No problem. Now, once you have identified a project which has potential parity improvement, you'll implement that project first. Second, once you implement that project, you already know some are worse off, some are better off. So try to identify those two groups. Because after identifying the two groups, we have these three things, sub-bullets. Look for the compensation principle. Evaluate the trade-off between efficiency and inequality. You have the measure. And calculate the weighted net benefit. With more weights to the poor, lower weights to the rich, because one of your primary concern is equality. Okay. So now the thing is, till now we have discussed only theory with certain examples. Now, when we actually do a problem, we have to calculate a lot of things. But in general, if you know how to measure deadweight loss, you have a measure of efficiency. Now take either poverty gap or Lorenz curve or anything to have a measure of inefficiency. inequality. Right. And now, from this very simple picture, you exactly know while you are calculating that efficiency, na, if there is a deadweight loss of the efficiency. But this measuring this benefit, if the total benefit is more, aggregate benefit is more, you understand there is a scope of tariff improvement. Now, once you identify those two groups, a group which is better off, a group which is worse off, you already know that aggregate net benefit must be positive. Until and unless that is the case, you are not going to implement the project, right? You are not going to implement a project for which aggregate net benefit is negative. And why do I need that? To implement a compensation principle. How much I need to compensate the worse off group? You already have these measures of efficiency, deadweight loss, inequality, maybe Lorentz curve, and evaluate the trade-off. Mostly through lump sum taxation. Because the moment you put some commodity tax, different set of inefficiency will creep in. But the moment you use the Hicksian compensation, lump sum transfers, you can evaluate the trade-off. And calculate the weighted net benefits. Right? Look, this is not simple. Whatever is there on this particular slide, it is not simple. But obviously, it is not as problematic as this one. Theoretically, so this is the normative part, and this is the positive part. So you have to have a simple idea, sorry, not simple, you need to have a thorough idea about the theory. But once you have a theory, you also understand the practical problems of implementing. To solve for those practical problems, you have a very different looking objective. But look, there is no conflict between what we do in practice and what we have proposed in theory. The only thing is we have redefined a number of things. We have replaced one theoretical measure by one practical measure, one variable with another. Okay, so that is the debate and the trade-off between efficiency and equity. So let me start a new thing. So I'll stop sharing this particular slide. Yeah. Now I have a second one. Just hold on. Please give me one moment. Let me edit that. Is it visible, the new slide?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. So now we'll start this topic today. This is, as you can see, we are now starting to shift our focus and trying to enter the domain of the mechanism of providing public goods and sometimes publicly provided private goods. We'll define all these things, okay? Again, just like every module, we start with certain basic questions. The government supplies a wide variety of goods, right? There are certain goods. Take, for example, education, healthcare. These are also available in the private domain. You have private hospitals, you have private schools, private colleges, private universities, right? And there are certain set of goods which are exclusively provided by the government. There is no private player who can provide you something like national defense. Private security, yes. National defense. So the thing that we need to understand that what should be provided by the government, how much should be provided by the government. To understand these very questions, first we need to understand what are the economic properties of these goods. What are the characteristics of these goods? And how to principally they differ from the private market. Right? This we need to understand. As I mentioned at the beginning of today's lecture, that I will not take the entire lecture. That's why I'm not giving any break right now. I have a meeting. I have to leave early a little bit, maybe 10:30. I'll stop. So that's why I'm continuing. Now, if you remember, there are basically two properties. Now, these two properties might seem very simple. Apparently, they're very simple properties, but they have very, very long-run implications. The two core properties of a pure public good is, remember, it's non-excludable. The moment I am using it, I cannot exclude you from using it. And it is also non-rival. When I am using it, I am not reducing the quantity available to you. The same 1 kilometer stretch of road. That 1 kilometer is available to both me and you. Whether I walk, you walk, it does not affect anyone else. And when I am walking on the road, I cannot say that when I'm walking on the road, you cannot walk. Right? There's no point. And we have studied a point. This point I'm not going to explain much because we have studied it. The relation between public goods and market failure. Because if you remember, there is a social optimal, there is a private optimal. Right? So if there is a free riding issue, if there is no one is willing to pay, the market will not exist at all. Though had the good been there, everyone would have been benefited, right? We have talked about under market failure topic. Now, If the good is a pure public good, you cannot exclude. Now, suppose exclusion is possible. Same example of road. Put a toll plaza, toll tax. If you don't want to pay the toll, you cannot use the road. Right? It's your choice. I'm giving you, the user, a choice. Use it, not use it. If you want to use it, you have to pay the toll. But consumption is still non-life. Then government charge user fees. Just right now, it told. Now, this user fees, by its nature, are to some extent what we'll say that equitable method, equitable mode of raising revenues for the government. Why? Those who use, they pay the most. If you use it every day, you pay higher toll. If you use it only sparingly, you pay less. So look, your willingness to pay and what you pay are directly linked. If you are not willing to pay for that public good, you're not going to use it. Suppose there is a public park with an entry fee. Every time you enter, you have to purchase, suppose a very token amount, 5 rupees ticket, 10 rupees ticket. So those who are enjoying that public good more are going to pay more. Now this is possible because exclusion is possible. If you do not purchase the ticket, you are not allowed inside the park. Right? The problem is we are still in the domain of non-rival consumption. The moment we are having a user fee and non-rival consumption, there is certain inefficiency. Okay, how? Let's take for example a bridge. Number of times you cross the bridge is a function of, or it is contingent upon, the toll that you have to pay. You can lower the toll. More people will use. And suppose there is a threshold capacity of that bridge. At a particular point of time, the bridge can handle these many vehicles. Suppose that's given by QC. Now, for any value which is less than QC, there is no congestion and hence no marginal cost. So, if you have, think of a lift, it says capacity 10 people. As long as 10 people enter that lift, you can comfortably go up and there is no non-rival case of consumption. But suppose the 11th person tries to push it, then everyone is getting like, okay, I have to move here, I have to, it's become congested, it is suffocating, I'm getting cramped, right? Similarly, in a bridge or any other like a public park, if there is a capacity, everything has a capacity. Above that, the non-rival nature will start disappearing. Because you are eating up into the space the moment this capacity is breached. So if the capacity, suppose QC is that bridge capacity, and if the toll is like P, people will use QE much less than QC. There is no congestion, no problem with that non-rival assumption. Now, when I'm below this threshold level, the marginal cost is zero. So if you want to have an efficient, yes, any question or anything? I just heard a noise. Anyway, so this non-rival thing, as look, I'm still in the domain where QE is less than the capacity. It's a non-rival, right? You don't have any marginal cost. So if marginal cost is zero, then what we know? P equal to MC. Efficiency parameter, the price of usage should be zero. The revenue that the bridge will be you generating then will be zero, should be zero. Now, this is the very simple difference between publicly provided and privately available. So there is a private market and there is a public provision. If the bridge is actually owned by a person, he can charge anything. So the revenue would exceed the cost of bridge. And he will maximize the revenue and he will build a bridge if and only if this revenue is more than or at least equal to the cost of the bridge. Right? For the government, it is more of a public provision. It is not about profit maximization. It is all about social welfare maximization. Look, the objective functions are different. So it might just charge a toll required to break even, which is I just required to cover the cost. Now, it might as well charge a toll less than what you require to break even. And you finance that deficit from some other revenue. And that is what it's mostly done. Because most of the roads in India, 95% of roads are not under the toll. Only 5% of the roads have toll. So how do these 95% free roads are being provided by the government, maintained by the government? By financing it through some other revenue generated in some other areas by the government, right? Now, as I said, it might not even charge a toll at all. So, look, we are bringing back that equity consideration, right? First thing, and so the principle that those who benefit from that bridge should bear the cost. That is the equity consideration. And also I have another consideration, which is the efficiency consideration. What is efficiency consideration? That this QE should be less than equal to QC, whatever the case may be. Because the moment this is bridged, you have inefficiency. And we'll see shortly how that happens. Now, there are certain goods which has very high costs of exclusion. We know, for example, Bangalore is one of the most congested cities in the country. However, putting a toll inside the city will be a big problem. Almost infeasible. You cannot put a toll plaza or tax collection mechanism in a city itself. Highways, that's possible. Now the question is, you have demand for the road. You are overusing it, but there is a very high cost of exclusion. So you cannot exclude. So basically the outcome will not be parity efficient. The question is, can a private farm solve this issue? The moment a private firm enters, it will charge for the services it provides, right? Now the question is, those who benefit from the service and those who will contribute for that service. Now, if you somehow believe that even if you do not contribute, you will still get the benefit, you do not have the incentive to pay for the service. This is a classic free rider problem we talk about when it comes to voluntary contribution, right? Now, we'll define pure and impure public goods. Now, what is a pure public good? Look, this comes from the definition of non-rivaling consumption. So if a good is a pure public good, when I'm using it, there is no added cost incurred by the provider of that public good if you use it. Once the 1 kilometer road is built, whether one person uses it, two people use it, or n number of people use it, does not add to the cost. Right? That's the marginal cost we're talking about from the beginning. So the marginal cost of providing this public good to an additional person is strictly zero. And hence it is impossible for the exclusion principle to implement the exclusion principle. Now, if I'm looking at this particular case definition, then a number of goods or services will not remain pure public good. If we follow this strict zero marginal cost definition. Because let's go back to that bridge. We have a capacity. So then more, if you increase, there is one additional person above that capacity, you are incurring cost, additional cost through congestion, through maybe added probability of accidents, because the spacing is reduced. So it might be very, very small, but not zero. And now the possibility of exclusion comes in. And that is why you have these toll plazas in highways. Okay. Look, you can use these two variables to classify pure and impure public goods. And what are these two dimensions? One is the marginal cost of goods. Whether when I'm talking about a pure public good example, national defense, first thing, you just can't exclude anyone. So in the ease of exclusion access, national defense is very, very low. So the ease is not there. So it's very difficult to exclude anyone, or it's impossible to say anyone who is a citizen of the country that will be excluded from the benefits of national defense. Now, once national defense expenditure is being made, whether a new kid is born or not, it does not make any difference to the marginal cost. And hence, if the marginal cost of use is very low, and the ease of exclusion is also very low, or tending to zero, you have the case of a pure public. Take, for example, fire services. The marginal cost, that is absolutely almost equal to national defense. You have a fire service station. Whether there are 10 people to be served or 11 people to be served does not make any difference. But yes, you can exclude. So there is a fire in a warehouse, the fire tending machines, they are there, right? What you call those trucks? I forgot. Fire, I forgot that name. It's a very simple, common thing. I forgot. Whatever. So this firefighting trucks, they are there, but you have to pay some amount. Just like you have to pay for the ambulance, right? Similar. So ease of exclusion is high. Now, highway. Ease of exclusion is not very high. You can use a toll, but you cannot put a toll amount very, very high. So most of the people will move from point A to point B. Else you have to make a parallel bad road. Who will use that road if they don't want to use the toll gate? Right. And that is why ease of exclusion is low, but the marginal cost is very high. Health services, education services, both are high. Then exclude, pay the fees, or don't get the service. Also, one student, additional student, one additional patient, the marginal cost is also right.
Sir, I had a doubt.
Yes.
So this very concept of ease of exclusion is based on our societal norms, right? Let's say I'm talking about Scandinavia or something wherein it's normalized that health services are free. So suddenly if the government goes to introduce a cost on them, so for them ease of exclusion would be very low, right?
No, I'm not saying that if it is possible to exclude, the ease of exclusion is high, then you need to do that. I'm just talking about the possibility. If required, you can. Take, for example, this pure public good example, national defense. Even if you need right now a higher number of army personnel to be maintained, you cannot say only those who are paying for that service will get the service. You just cannot do it. I'm talking about a feasibility concept. What you should do, what you can do are different things. So in defining ease of exclusion, you might say in Scandinavia, not only education is free, public transport is also free. And in fact, I forgot, most probably in Denmark or Norway, out of these two countries, I exactly forgot which one. Most of the residential buildings are owned by the government. And so, if you are a young person, you'll be allotted fourth floor. If you're very old or if you have some physical uh, issues, then you'll be allotted a ground floor. That's the structure. That's I said. That's the structure of what we call the welfare state. The Scandinavian countries follow the welfare state model. But I'm not saying which particular policy regime I should implement. That part I have not yet arrived. What I'm saying, you can. You can create a toll in a highway, but it's very difficult to create a toll plaza within a city. People will just break it down. It is not possible. I'm talking about that feasibility. Now, and depending on that feasibility, you are defining. Because you can understand when I'm talking about health services, education services, health might well be absolutely free, but insurance is not. So I have spent some time in Europe myself. I had a health insurance which reimbursed me everything to the cent, but the service was not. So I had to pay almost to the tune, if I remember correctly, in 2009-10, I had to pay 60-70 euros for one doctor visit. But every cent was reimbursed through that insurance. And that is why the country I was talking about is Netherlands. In Netherlands, look, it does not have a very different structure from Norway or Denmark. The development perspective, the GDP per capita perspective is not much different. Price wise also it's not much different. Copenhagen and Amsterdam almost, Copenhagen is less, a little more costly. But In Copenhagen, as you said, it is free. Anyone who goes there, it is there for free. So it is being financed from other tax sources. If suppose that source dry up completely, what will you do? Either you have to take care of through insurance, or you have to impose some charges. Either way, you are going to pay. So the feasibility or the ease with which you can implement it is high. I can exclude, that does not mean I should exclude. When I'm talking about ease of exclusion, I mean with ease I can exclude. Whether I should or not, that depends on a lot of things, including the point you made, the tradition. Right? Now, as you said, I said the club goods. Consumption is non-right, but you can exclude. If you do not have a subscription, you do not watch. Simple. Right. So what we're talking about is basically the feasibility of rationing is not the issue, but the cost. Now, we call this cost as transaction costs. Look, this is a very interesting point. That the cost of exclusion are relatively small for private goods. Why? You just need to have a law and order system. No one can come, snatch my burger, and take it. But for publicly provided goods, for private goods, you have a ownership. That's a definition of a private good. I own this place. You just cannot come and start living on my terrace. You just need to call up the police station and the police will come free of cost and do its duty. Evict that intruder. Arrest that intruder. So the cost of exclusion is really small or very small in cases of private goods. But this cost of exclusion for public goods is very, very high. Sometimes it's prohibitive. Why prohibitive? Just think of because I always come up with these national defenses. Suppose national weather update. It is posted in the public domain. So can you charge a particular person accessing a public portal? Now portal is public, so it is not excluded. No one is excluded from the public portal. It is information given. Can you exclude a person like, okay, no, he has paid, only he can read, you cannot read. I am declaring a siren that a tsunami is coming. Because you have paid, only you can listen to that siren. You have not paid, you cannot listen to that siren. That's not possible, right? So the private for public goods, this is quite high, sometimes prohibitive. And we have already talked this part. I'm not going to repeat much. that externalities are impure public good. Because if there exist externalities, look, I'm talking about the rivalry in consumption. If there are externalities, my consumption might have an impact on your consumption, but not exactly the same, less. Okay. So we can treat externalities as impure public goods. Now, there can be global and local public goods. Obviously, from the definition, you can understand a local police. But there are global public goods. Take, for example, global environment. We're always talking about global warming. This COVID outbreak, it's about global health. And there is a particular concept of global security also. Now, if there is a public good, now we are coming to the tricky part or the interesting parts, I will say. You need a collective action. Because if you leave it to the private market, there will be an undersupply of public good. Why? People will try to free ride, not reveal their actual willingness to pay. So the total willingness to pay will be quoted less. So the demand curve is misrepresenting, underrepresenting, and hence it will be provided. It's very simple. Now, national governments are there which provide national goods, local governments, some local private goods. Problem is, there is no one who provides global public goods. So this is something where we need to understand the different negotiations, the different bargaining that goes on, the different strategic interactions that happen between different national agencies to ensure provision of global public good. So the collective action becomes even more critical when we talk about global goods. The problem is there is no provider of global public goods, but the demand for global public good has gone up over time because of lower transportation costs, faster transportations, declining communication costs. We say now we live in a global village. That type of jargon we use. If there is a security concern, take for example a bug or a malware affecting certain banks, financial institutes in US, it will affect us also. Because it is not country specific, it is not region specific. If there is a financial contagion, the entire globe gets affected. The impact of 9/11 is not contained only in the US, everywhere. Cyber warfare. Now, the most recent concern is whether Taliban has access to nuclear weapons, because that will be again a global threat. So the demand for global goods, global public goods, have increased over time. But the provision, no. because you require huge amount of coordination among national governments. Okay, so I will stop here today because I have a meeting to attend. And I apologize for that, but I declared that at the beginning of the lecture. We'll continue here from the next week. So if you have any questions, I had just had it. And hopefully, sorry, but you asked a question, that Scandinavia example, healthcare. Was I able to answer your question? I think that was Abhinav, right?
Yes,
Who
sir,
asked.
yes, I get it. Like you were just talking about how easy it would be in real life to just exclude it. Okay, sir, I understood.
Basically, the look, the normative and positive, these are the two parts. We are still in the, when we're talking about these publicly provided goods or private goods, this when I'm differentiating between different types of public goods, depending on rivalry and excludability. Basically, we're still in the normative domain. The positive domain, what should be done, how to be done, that will come. So if you have any questions, please go ahead. I'll stop the recording.